Down in the basement, the birds soon discovered another little flight of steps going up, and in another minute the audience was shrieking with laughter as the penguins' heads suddenly appeared, one by one, in the orchestra pit where the musicians were playing. The musicians kept on playing, and the lady on the stage, when she saw the penguins, sang all the louder to show how angry she was. The audience was laughing so hard nobody could hear the words of her song. Mr. Popper, who had followed the penguins up the stairs, stopped when he saw it led to the orchestra pit. "I don't think I'm supposed to go up there with the musicians," he told Mrs. Popper. "The penguins did," said Mrs. Popper. "Papa, you better get them off before they start biting the pegs and strings off the fiddle," said Bill. "Oh, I just don't know what to do," said Mr. Popper, sitting down helplessly on the top step. "Then I will catch the penguins," said Mrs. Popper, climbing up past him, with Janey and Bill following. When they saw Mrs. Popper coming after them, the penguins felt very guilty, because they knew they did not belong there. So they jumped up on the stage, ran over the footlights, and hid under the singing lady's blue dress. That stopped the singing entirely, except for one high, shrill note that had not been written in the music. The birds loved the bright lights of the theater and the great laughing audiences and all the traveling. There was always something new to see. From Stillwater out to the Pacific coast they traveled. It was a long way now to the little house at 432 Proudfoot Avenue, where the Poppers had had to worry about whether their money would hold out until spring. And every week they got a check for $5,000. When they were not actually playing in some theater or traveling on trains between cities, their life was spent in large hotels. Now and then a startled hotel keeper would object to having the birds register there. "We don't even allow dogs in this hotel," he would say. "Yes, but do you have a rule against penguins?" Mr. Popper would ask. Then the hotel keeper would have to admit there was not a rule about penguins, and of course, when he saw how neat the penguins were, and how the other guests came to his hotel in the hope of seeing them, he was very glad to have them. You might think a large hotel would offer a great many opportunities for mischief to a lot of penguins, but they behaved very well on the whole, never doing anything worse than riding up and down too often in the elevators and occasionally biting the brass buttons off some bellboy's uniform. $5,000 a week may sound like a great deal of money, yet the Poppers were far from rich. It was quite expensive to live in grand hotels and taxi about town in taxicabs. Mr. Popper often thought that the penguins could just as well have walked back and forth between hotels and theaters, that every one of their walls looked so much like a parade it always tied up the traffic. So Mr. Popper, who never liked to be a nuisance to anyone, always took taxis instead. It was expensive to have huge cakes of ice brought up to their hotel rooms to cool the penguins. The bills in the fine restaurants where the Poppers often took their meals were dreadfully high. Fortunately, however, the penguins' food had stopped being an expense to them. On the road, they had to give up having tank cars of live fish shipped to them because it was so hard to get deliveries on time, so they went back to feeding the birds on canned shrimps. This cost them absolutely nothing, for Mr. Popper had written a testimonial saying, "Poppers performing penguins thrive on Owen's Oceanic Shrimp." This statement with a picture of the 12 penguins was printed in all the leading magazines, and the Owens Shrimp Company gave Mr. Popper an order that was good for free cans of shrimps at any grocery store anywhere in the country. Several other companies, like the Great Western Spinach Growers Association and the Energetic Breakfast Oats Company, wanted him to recommend their product too, and offered him large sums of cash. But the penguins simply refused to eat spinach or oats, and Mr. Popper was much too honest to say they would, even though he knew the money would come in handy. From the Pacific coast they turned east again to cross the continent. They had time enough on this brief tour to touch only the larger cities, and after Minneapolis they played Milwaukee, Chicago, Detroit, Cleveland, and Philadelphia. Wherever they went, their reputation traveled ahead of them. When, early in April, they reached Boston, huge crowds awaited them in the railway station. Up to now it had not been too difficult to keep the penguins comfortable, but a warm spring wind was blowing across Boston, and at the hotel Mr. Popper had to have ice brought up to his rooms in 1,000-pound blocks. He was glad to see the 10-week contract was almost up, and that the next week, when his birds were to appear in New York, was the last. Already Mr. Greenbaum was writing a new contract. Mr. Popper was beginning to think, however, he'd better be getting back to Stillwater, because the penguins were growing irritable. If it was unseasonably warm in Boston, it was actually hot in New York. In their rooms at the Great Tower Hotel overlooking Central Park, the penguins were feeling the heat badly. Mr. Popper took them on the roof garden to catch whatever cool breeze might be blowing. The penguins were all charmed by the sparkling lights and the confusion of the city below. The younger birds began crowding over to the edge of the roof and looking down at the great canyons beneath them. It made Mr. Popper very nervous to see them shoving each other as if at any moment they might succeed in pushing one over. He remembered how the South Pole penguins always did this to find out what danger lay below. The roof was not a safe place for them. Mr. Popper had never forgotten how badly frightened he had been when Captain Cook had been so ill before Greta came. He could not risk the chance of losing one of his penguins now. Where the penguins were concerned, nothing was ever too much trouble for him. He took them downstairs again and bathed them under cold showers in the bathroom. This kept him busy a large part of the night. With all this lack of sleep, he was drowsy the next morning when he had to call the taxis to get to the theater. Besides, Mr. Popper had always been a little absent-minded. I'll come back with more tomorrow.